What if one act of kindness could change your life forever? A struggling delivery driver saves a stranger, only to uncover secrets, face challenges, and find a chance to rebuild everything. This is a story of resilience, sacrifice, and the ripple effect of compassion. Stay tuned. You won't believe where this journey leads. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The biting cold of Detroit's winter night cut through the crevices of Jonas Turner's old delivery van. The heater, long broken, blew lukewarm air that barely kept the frost off the windshield. Jonas tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles pale against the cracked plastic, as he glanced at the dashboard clock. 11:47 p.m. He was running out of time to finish his last delivery before the shift ended. Jonas lived for these late-night hours, driving through the sleeping city. The quiet soothed him, giving him space to think about his mother's medical bills, his sister Leah's school supplies, and the unrelenting grind of trying to keep their fragile world intact. As he turned onto a dimly lit stretch of highway, a sudden flash of red caught his eye. At the edge of the road, a car had careened into a utility pole, the front end crumpled like paper. Steam hissed from the engine, rising into the freezing air. Jonas instinctively slowed down. He squinted through the windshield, and trying to make sense of the shadowy figure slumped over the steering wheel. "Damn it," Jonas muttered under his breath. He couldn't afford another delay. But as his father's words echoed in his mind, "You never leave someone in need, no matter what it costs you," his foot eased onto the brake. He pulled over, the van's worn tires crunching against the icy shoulder. Jonas grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, the winter wind biting through his thin jacket. The air smelled of gasoline and scorched rubber. "Hey, you okay in there?" Jonas shouted, his voice barely cutting through the whistling wind. The man in the car didn't respond. Jonas approached cautiously, his flashlight revealing the driver. An older man, face pale, forehead smeared with blood. His breaths came shallow and labored, visible in the freezing air. Jonas tapped on the window, but there was no reaction. "Hang on," Jonas muttered, yanking the door handle. It was stuck. After several tries, he wedged his shoulder against the door and forced it open. The man groaned weakly as Jonas leaned in. His suit, an expensive one, Jonas noted absently, was torn and stained. "Sir, can you hear me? I'm going to get you out of here." "Hospital?" The man gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, help." Jonas hesitated. The nearest hospital was 20 minutes away, and the snowstorm was picking up. His van wasn't exactly built for emergencies, but leaving the man here wasn't an option. "All right," Jonas said, more to himself than the man. "We're doing this." It took all of Jonas's strength to pull the man out of the car. He was heavier than he looked, and every step toward the van felt like a battle against the icy wind. By the time he managed to get the man into the passenger seat and buckle him in, Jonas's hands were numb, and his jacket was damp with sweat. Sliding into the driver's seat, Jonas started the engine. The van sputtered before roaring to life, the only familiar sound in an otherwise surreal moment. Jonas glanced at his passenger, who was now slumped against the door, his head lolling with each bump in the road. "Stay with me, okay?" Jonas said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We're almost there." The drive to the hospital felt endless. The snow thickened, coating the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. Jonas gritted his teeth, leaning forward as if that would help him see through the blizzard. Come on," he muttered, glancing at the man beside him. His breathing was shallow, his lips tinged blue. Jonas pressed harder on the gas, praying the old van wouldn't betray him now. Finally, the hospital's glowing red emergency sign emerged through the snow. Jonas swerved into the driveway, slamming the van into park. He jumped out, waving frantically at the paramedics near the entrance. "Help!" he shouted. "This guy's in bad shape!" The emergency team rushed out with a stretcher. Jonas stepped back, letting them do their work. His heart pounded as he watched them load the man onto the stretcher and wheel him inside. One of the nurses turned to him. "What happened?" she asked, her voice brisk but not unkind. "Found him on the highway," Jonas said, his breath coming in visible puffs. "His car hit a pole. He was unconscious when I got there." "You did the right thing," she said. "We'll take it from here." Jonas lingered by the entrance, his legs feeling like lead. He wanted to ask if the man would be okay, but the urgency of the medical staff made it clear he wasn't going to get an answer tonight. As the automatic doors slid shut, Jonas stood alone in the swirling snow, the adrenaline fading and exhaustion setting in. He had done what he could, but now he was late for work, a fact that settled in his stomach like a rock. Sliding back into the van, Jonas gripped the wheel, his father's words echoing once again. With a deep breath, Jonas started the engine and drove off into the night. The first rays of dawn began to pierce through the gray Detroit skyline as Jonas Turner parked his battered van in the lot behind Garrison Logistics, the warehouse where he worked as a delivery driver. The engine sputtered as it shut off, the sound a fitting echo of Jonas's frayed nerves. His shift had technically ended hours ago, but the detour to the hospital had thrown his entire night into chaos. Jonas pulled his jacket tighter around himself as he entered the employee entrance. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the bustling activity of early morning deliveries. His supervisor, Frank Nolan, was waiting near the clock-in terminal, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. Frank's sour expression was enough to tell Jonas what was coming. "You're late," Frank barked, not even giving Jonas a chance to explain. "And don't bother clocking out. We need to talk." Jonas swallowed hard, his hands clenching at his sides. "I can explain. You were supposed to finish your route by 2 a.m., Frank interrupted, his tone sharp. "What happened?" Jonas hesitated, weighing his words. Do I tell him the truth, or does it even matter? "I found a man on the side of the road," Jonas said finally, keeping his voice steady. "His car crashed. He was injured, unconscious. I couldn't just leave him there. I took him to the hospital." Frank's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the clipboard. "And you think that excuses you from doing your job? We've got deadlines, Jonas. Customers don't care about your Good Samaritan routine." Jonas felt a flicker of anger rise in his chest, but he kept it in check. "It wasn't just some routine. The guy could have died." "Save it," Frank snapped. "This isn't the first time you've been late. You're unreliable, and this company doesn't have room for people who can't prioritize their responsibilities. Consider this your last day." The words hit Jonas like a punch to the gut. "You're firing me? For saving someone's life?" Frank shrugged, his expression cold. "Call it whatever you want. Pack your things." Jonas stared at him for a long moment, 1,000 retorts bubbling up, but none escaping his lips. He finally turned and headed to the break room, his footsteps echoing against the polished concrete floor. The humiliation was a bitter weight in his chest as he emptied his locker into his worn-out backpack. By the time Jonas arrived home, the sun was higher in the sky, casting its cold winter light over the dilapidated duplex he shared with his mother, Margaret, and his 10-year-old sister, Leah. The peeling paint on the front door and the sagging porch railing were reminders of the financial strain that defined their lives. Margaret was in the kitchen when Jonas walked in, her frail frame hunched over the table as she sorted through a stack of medical bills. She looked up, her face lighting with a smile despite the deep lines of exhaustion that marked her features. "You're home early," she said, though her voice held a note of concern. Jonas set his backpack down and rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, there was a situation at work." Margaret's smile faded. "What kind of situation?" Jonas hesitated, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "I got fired." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Margaret's expression shifted from concern to worry, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her tea. "Fired? Jonas, how? Why?" "I stopped to help someone," Jonas said, his voice tight. "A man was hurt in a car crash. I took him to the hospital, and I was late finishing my deliveries. That's all they cared about." Margaret closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. "Oh, Jonas." "I'll figure it out," Jonas said quickly, not wanting her to spiral into panic. "I'll find another job." "But how soon?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The rent's due next week, and I still need my medication. What about Leah, her school trip?" "I'll figure it out," Jonas repeated, though even he wasn't sure how. Later that evening, Jonas sat on the creaky porch steps, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The air was crisp, the stars faint against the city lights. A soft creak behind him broke the silence as Mrs. Donnelly, their elderly neighbor, shuffled out onto her own porch next door. Rough day? She asked, her voice warm but perceptive. Jonas gave her a faint smile. You could say that. Mrs. Donnelly settled into her rocking chair, pulling a knit shawl tighter around her shoulders. Life's funny, isn't it? You do something good, something selfless, and it feels like the universe punishes you for it. Jonas looked at her, surprised by her insight. Yeah, that's exactly how it feels. She chuckled softly, the sound tinged with years of wisdom. But you know what my mother used to say? Kindness doesn't always pay you back the way you expect, but it always pays you back. Jonas frowned, resting his elbows on his knees. Right now, it doesn't feel like it's paying anything. Give it time, Mrs. Donnelly said, her voice gentle. Sometimes the seeds we plant take a while to grow. Just don't stop planting them. Jonas nodded, her words sinking in despite his frustration. As the night deepened, he sat alone on the porch, gazing at the faint city lights and clinging to the sliver of hope her words had sparked. The bustling hallway of St. Luke's Hospital was alive with the rhythmic hum of machines, soft whispers of nurses, and the occasional chime of an intercom. Victor Hammond sat upright in his hospital bed, the sterile white sheets pulled neatly across his lap. His head still throbbed from the accident, but the haze that had clouded his mind since that night had begun to lift. He stared out the window. The snow now a gentle flurry, a stark contrast to the chaos that had engulfed him days earlier. A knock on the door pulled his attention away. His wife, Elaine Hammond, entered the room, her tailored coat draped elegantly over her arm. Her eyes, though lined with worry, sparkled with relief when they met his. "You're looking better," she said, setting her bag down on the chair beside his bed. Victor nodded, his voice still gravelly. "Better than I felt when they brought me in. Thanks to whoever it was that stopped." Elaine perched on the edge of the bed, her hand resting lightly on his. "The doctor said it was a man. He found you on the side of the road and brought you here. Without him?" Her voice faltered and she shook her head, refusing to finish the thought. Victor's brows furrowed. "Did they get his name? I need to thank him." Elaine shook her head. "No, he didn't stay long enough. Just told the nurses what happened and left." Victor leaned back against the pillows, his mind racing. Who was this man? Why would someone go to such lengths for a stranger? A few days after being discharged, Victor Hammond was consumed with a single purpose: finding the man who had saved his life. Armed with little more than a description of a delivery van, an approximate time, and a few details from the hospital staff, he enlisted the help of local authorities to track his rescuer down. Officer Derek Shaw, a middle-aged man, took up the case. He listened intently as Victor recounted the events of that fateful night. "A delivery van around that time?" Shaw mused, tapping his pen against a notepad. "We'll cross-check the delivery schedules with local businesses. If he's a regular worker in the area, we'll find him." Within a couple of days, Shaw had a lead. "We've identified a driver, Jonas Turner," he told Victor and Elaine, "works for Garrison Logistics. According to his manager, he was fired recently for being late, around the time he brought you to the hospital." Victor's jaw tightened at the news. "Fired? For saving someone's life?" Shaw nodded grimly. "Unfortunately, not everyone sees the bigger picture, but I have his address here if you'd like to thank him in person." The following morning, Shaw drove them to a modest neighborhood in Detroit, the city still cloaked in the remnants of winter. Snow clung stubbornly to the edges of the cracked sidewalks, and icicles hung like jagged teeth from the eaves of rundown houses. As the police cruiser pulled up in front of the address, Victor and Elaine were struck by the stark reality of Jonas's life. The small house, its paint peeling and roof sagging, seemed barely able to withstand the season's harshness. The yard was littered with remnants of childhood: rusted bicycles, a faded basketball hoop missing its net, and a scattering of broken toys. Elaine's breath hitched as she surveyed the scene. "This is where he lives?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor nodded grimly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Looks like it." Shaw stepped out of the car and knocked on the door. After a moment, it creaked open slightly, revealing a young girl with wide eyes and a tangle of dark curls. She clutched a tattered book to her chest and eyed the strangers warily. "Hi there," Shaw said gently, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "Is Jonas Turner home?" The girl looked over her shoulder, her small voice calling, "Jonas, someone's here for you." A few moments later, Jonas appeared in the doorway. His expression shifted from confusion to guardedness as he took in the sight. A sharply dressed couple flanked by a uniformed police officer. "I'm Jonas," he said, his voice steady but cautious. "What's this about?" Victor stepped forward, extending a hand. "I'm Victor Hammond. You saved my life." Jonas blinked, his grip tightening on the door frame. "Oh, right. How are you doing?" "Better," Victor said, a small smile breaking across his face. "Thanks to you." Elaine stepped forward, her voice warm. "We wanted to come and thank you properly. What you did that night, it wasn't something everyone would have done." Jonas shrugged, glancing at the floor. "Did what anyone should. You needed help." Victor's smile faltered as he looked past Jonas into the dimly lit home. From where he stood, he could see an older woman, frail and wrapped in a blanket, sitting in a recliner. The faint hum of medical equipment and the stacks of papers, bills most likely, on the coffee table painted a sobering picture. "You've got a lot on your plate," Victor said quietly. "I didn't realize." Jonas's shoulders stiffened slightly. "It's nothing we can't handle." Victor exchanged a glance with Elaine, who gave a barely perceptible nod. "Jonas," Victor began, his tone firm but kind, "you didn't just save me that night. You gave me a second chance, and I want to return the favor." Jonas frowned, shaking his head. "That's not necessary. I didn't do it expecting anything in return." "I know," Victor said, stepping closer. "But it doesn't change the fact that you and your family deserve better. Let me help." Elaine chimed in, her voice gentle but resolute. "Please, this isn't charity. It's gratitude." Jonas hesitated, glancing back at the woman in the recliner, his mother, no doubt, watching the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and hope. Finally, Jonas sighed. "What exactly are you offering?" Victor smiled, the relief evident in his expression. "For starters, let's talk about getting your mother the medical care she needs." Officer Shaw tipped his hat. "I think my job here is done. You're in good hands, Jonas." The following week, Jonas found himself sitting in the polished office of one of Detroit's top cardiologists. Margaret sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she listened to the doctor explain her treatment options. For the first time in years, hope flickered in her eyes. Victor and Elaine had not only covered the cost of the initial consultation, but had also arranged for a specialist to oversee her care. As they left the office, Margaret turned to Jonas, her voice trembling. "How did this happen?" Jonas looked away, unsure how to explain. "Just someone paying it forward, I guess." But the help didn't stop there. Days later, a notice from the bank regarding their overdue mortgage was replaced with confirmation that the payments had been settled. Their small, crumbling house was safe, for now. Margaret and Leah were overjoyed, but Jonas couldn't shake the unease that settled in his chest. He had spent so long carrying the weight of his family's struggles alone that accepting help felt almost foreign. What if he couldn't live up to their expectations? What if this was too good to be true? As he lay awake that night, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, his father's voice echoed in his mind. "Pride's a fine thing, son, but it doesn't fill an empty stomach." Jonas sighed, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. Maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let someone else carry the load for a while. The Hammond estate was a world away from the modest streets of Jonas Turner's Detroit neighborhood. The sprawling mansion, with its manicured gardens and towering oak doors, stood as a testament to Victor Hammond's decades of success in business. But behind its grandeur lay tensions that no amount of wealth could mask. Victor sat in his sunlit study, sipping a steaming cup of Earl Grey, as he reviewed plans for helping the Turner family. His wife, Elaine, sat across from him, sorting through a stack of documents outlining Jonas's needs. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. Elliot Hammond, Victor's eldest son, stormed into the room. Dressed in a tailored suit, his presence radiated authority and impatience. "Dad," Elliot began, his tone clipped. "I need to talk to you." Victor looked up, his expression calm but firm. "Good morning to you too, Elliot. What's on your mind?" Elliot gestured to the paper spread across the desk. "This. I hear you've been throwing money at some random guy you barely know. What exactly is going on?" Victor set his teacup down, his gaze steady. His name is Jonas Turner. He saved my life. And now you're trying to save his? Elliot retorted, his voice rising. I get it, Dad. You're grateful. But this is excessive. Paying for his mother's medical bills, covering their mortgage. Don't you think you're being taken advantage of? Elaine bristled, her voice sharp. Taken advantage of? Elliot, this man risked everything to help your father. He didn't ask for anything in return. Elliot scoffed, crossing his arms. And you think that means he won't? People aren't selfless, Mom. They see an opportunity and they take it. You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. Victor leaned forward, his tone measured but firm. Elliot, I understand your concerns, but you don't know Jonas. He's not the kind of man to exploit a situation. He's struggling to keep his family afloat, and we have the means to help. That's what matters. Elliot's jaw tightened. What about our family? Our company? You're risking everything you've built. Victor's expression darkened. The only thing I'm risking is the chance to do what's right. If you can't see that, then maybe you don't understand what this family truly stands for. Meanwhile, Jonas was grappling with his own doubts. The generosity of the Hammonds had brought a sense of relief, but it also left him feeling vulnerable. He had spent his entire life working for every scrap of stability he could find. Accepting help, especially on this scale, felt like walking on a tightrope with no safety net. The first real test of his resolve came when Elliot Hammond showed up unannounced at the Turner home. It was late afternoon, and Jonas was repairing a loose porch step when a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The vehicle's polished exterior stood in stark contrast to the weathered facade of Jonas's house. Elliot stepped out, his sharp features set in a mask of professionalism. "Mr. Turner," Elliot called, approaching with deliberate steps. Jonas wiped his hands on his jeans and stood, his brow furrowed. "Can I help you?" "I'm Elliot Hammond," he said, extending a hand. "Victor's son." Jonas shook his hand cautiously. "Nice to meet you. What brings you here?" Elliot's smile was tight, calculated. "I wanted to see for myself who my father's been so invested in, and to make sure there's no misunderstanding about the situation." Jonas's jaw tightened, sensing the underlying accusation. "I didn't ask for any of this, if that's what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Elliot replied smoothly. "But you have to admit, it's unusual for someone in your position to receive this level of support. My father's generosity can be overwhelming. I just want to make sure it's being appreciated and not taken for granted." Jonas's temper flared, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not looking for handouts. I've worked hard my whole life to take care of my family. Your father offered to help, and I'm grateful. But don't mistake gratitude for dependence." Elliot studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. Just remember, nothing in life is free." With that, he turned and walked back to his car, leaving Jonas standing on the porch, his fists clenched at his sides. That evening, Jonas sat with his mother and Leah at the dinner table, their simple meal of soup and bread warming the small kitchen. Margaret's spirits had lifted since beginning her treatment, her cheeks regaining some of their color. Leah chatted excitedly about her school day, oblivious to the weight pressing down on her brother. After dinner, Jonas stepped outside to clear his head. The night was cold and still, the distant hum of the city a faint backdrop. He thought about Elliot's visit, about the unspoken threat behind his words. Nothing in life is free. As much as Jonas wanted to brush it off, the truth lingered in the back of his mind. Victor's kindness had lifted a burden from his shoulders, but it had also placed a new one there, the fear of failing the people who believed in him. As he stood in the quiet, Mrs. Donnelly appeared on her porch, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "You look like you got the weight of the world on your back," she said. Jonas managed a small smile. "Feels like it sometimes?" She gave him a knowing look. "It's okay to let people help, you know. Doesn't make you any less strong." Jonas sighed, his breath visible in the cold air. "It's not that simple." "Life never is," Mrs. Donnelly said, her voice gentle. "But strength isn't about doing everything alone. It's about knowing when to accept a helping hand." Her words lingered with Jonas long after he went inside, his mind still wrestling with the conflict between pride and gratitude. Back at the Hammond estate, Victor sat in his study, staring at a framed photo of his family on his desk. Elaine entered quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. He'll come around, she said, referring to Elliot. Victor nodded, though his expression remained somber. I hope so, because this isn't just about helping Jonas, it's about showing Elliot what it means to lead with compassion. Elaine smiled softly, squeezing his shoulder. You're doing the right thing. And someday, he'll see that. Victor sighed, his gaze drifting to the window. For everyone's sake, I hope you're right. The low hum of the cardiology wing at St. Luke's Hospital provided an odd sense of comfort to Jonas as he sat in the waiting room. Margaret was with the specialist, undergoing her third treatment. The sight of her face brightening over the past weeks had reignited a sense of hope Jonas hadn't felt in years. For the first time, the future seemed like something worth looking forward to rather than just surviving. Across from him, Leah sat cross-legged in the worn-out waiting room chair, engrossed in a children's book Victor Hammond had gifted her. Despite her young age, she had picked up on the family's struggles and had grown unusually mature. Jonas couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt whenever he saw the worry flash across her face. You okay, kid? Jonas asked, nudging her with his foot. Leah looked up, her brown eyes wide and earnest. Are you okay? She countered, tilting her head. Jonas chuckled softly. Yeah, I guess I am. Good, she said firmly, returning to her book. You look less tired now. As they drove home later that day, the weight of the hospital visit seemed lighter than usual. The roads, still dusted with snow, glistened under the pale winter sun. But as they pulled into their driveway, the sight of the sleek black car parked at the curb made Jonas's stomach tighten. Victor Hammond stood by the car, his hands tucked into the pockets of a long overcoat. He turned as Jonas and Leah stepped out of the vehicle, offering a warm smile. Jonas, Victor said, his tone cheerful. Margaret, Leah, good to see you. Jonas nodded, unsure of what to say. What brings you by? Victor gestured toward the house. Let's talk inside. It's too cold to stand out here. Once inside, Margaret, though still visibly tired, insisted on making tea for their guest. Jonas noticed how Victor's eyes lingered on the modest furnishings and the well-worn surfaces of their home. It wasn't pity he saw in the man's expression. It was determination. When they were finally seated in the small living room, Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Jonas, I've been thinking a lot about what you've done for me and what I can do for you. You've already done more than enough, Jonas said quickly. We're getting back on our feet thanks to you. Victor shook his head. It's not enough, not yet. He pulled a folder from his coat and handed it to Jonas. I want to help you build something lasting. Something that gives you and your family more than just survival. Jonas opened the folder, his brows furrowing as he skimmed the contents. It was an application for a scholarship program at a local community college. The program was tailored for adults looking to re-enter the workforce or start new careers. I talked to the program director, Victor said. They're willing to waive all fees. You'd study business administration, build a foundation to take control of your future. Jonas stared at the papers, a mix of gratitude and apprehension churning in his chest. I don't know. School wasn't exactly my strong suit. Victor smiled. Neither was driving on icy roads, but you managed to save my life anyway. I have no doubt you can handle this. Margaret, who had been listening quietly, placed a hand on Jonas's arm. You should do it, she said softly. It's time to think about what you want, Jonas, not just what we need. Jonas glanced at Leah, who was watching him with a hopeful expression. The weight of their expectations was heavy, but it wasn't crushing. It was grounding. For the first time, Jonas felt like he had more than just himself to lean on. Okay, he said finally, his voice steady. I'll do it. The first day of class was daunting. Jonas stood outside the college building, his new backpack slung over one shoulder. The chatter of students, some younger, some older, filled the crisp morning air. He adjusted the strap of his bag, trying to calm the nerves twisting in his stomach. You're not backing out, are you? Victor's voice came from behind him. Jonas turned to see Victor standing there, a grin on his face. He was holding a thermos, which he handed to Jonas. Coffee, you'll need it? Jonas smirked. Didn't expect you to be my cheerleader. Victor's expression softened. You've got more people rooting for you than you think, Jonas. Go show them what you're made of. Over the next few months, Jonas threw himself into his studies. The transition wasn't easy. Balancing classes, taking care of Leah, and supporting Margaret's recovery demanded every ounce of his energy. But he was determined to make it work. His instructors quickly noticed his work ethic. In business strategy class, he posed questions that showed a deep understanding of the struggles faced by small businesses. In accounting, his knack for problem-solving began to shine. Victor continued to stay involved, checking in regularly and offering guidance when needed. One evening, as Jonas was working through a particularly difficult assignment, Victor stopped by with a stack of books. "These helped me when I was just starting out," Victor said, setting them on the table. "I thought they might help you too." Jonas looked at the titles. Books on leadership, finance, and entrepreneurship. He nodded, his voice tinged with gratitude. "Thanks. I'll make good use of them." "I know you will," Victor said with a smile. As the semester drew to a close, Jonas found himself standing in front of his class, presenting a project on creating sustainable business models for underserved communities. His voice was steady, his confidence growing with each passing word. When he finished, the applause was loud and genuine. That night, as he walked back to his car, Jonas felt a sense of accomplishment that was entirely new. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something. And for the first time in his life, he believed he could succeed. The Hammond estate, usually brimming with light and vitality, seemed subdued. The winter sun barely filtered through the heavy curtains in Victor Hammond's study. The man who had once been the picture of vigor now sat slumped in his leather armchair, a pale shadow of his former self. The diagnosis had come swiftly and without warning: Stage 3 lymphoma. Victor's hands rested on the armrests, trembling slightly. Across from him, Elaine sat in quiet anguish, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The news had shaken the family to its core, but Victor's resolve remained unyielding. "We need to talk to Jonas," Victor said, his voice gravelly but firm. "There's something I need him to understand before things get worse." Elaine looked at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "You're not giving up, Victor. You're going to fight this." "I'm not giving up," he replied softly. "But I won't let this stop what we've started. Jonas has the potential to change lives, and I need to know he'll carry this forward when I can't." When Jonas received the call, he was in the middle of helping Leah with her science project. The nervous excitement she'd shown all week had been a bright spot in their routine, but the tone of Elaine's voice on the phone erased all traces of lightheartedness. "Victor wants to see you," she said gently. "It's important." The weight in her voice told Jonas more than her words could. He promised to come by the next morning. The following day, Jonas arrived at the estate, a sense of unease settling over him as he stepped into the study. Victor was sitting by the window, a blanket draped over his legs despite the warmth of the room. When he looked up, his smile was faint but genuine. "Jonas," he greeted, his voice weaker than Jonas remembered. "Come in, sit." Jonas sat opposite him, his hands clasped tightly. "Mrs. Hammond said you needed to see me. Is everything okay?" Victor chuckled lightly, though it quickly turned into a cough. "Not exactly, but it's not about me. It's about you." Jonas frowned, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" Victor took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Jonas, when you saved me that night, you didn't just pull me out of that truck. You gave me a reason to rethink my priorities. I've spent most of my life chasing success, building wealth, making deals, but that night reminded me of what really matters: people, connection, kindness." He paused, his gaze steady. "You have that, Jonas. You have a heart that sees others before yourself. That's rare, and it's powerful. But it comes with responsibility." Jonas swallowed hard, unsure of where the conversation was heading. "What are you saying, Victor?" "I want you to continue this work," Victor said, "not just for your family, but for others like you, people who need someone to believe in them. I'm asking you to lead, to take what we've started and turn it into something bigger." Jonas's chest tightened. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that. I'm still figuring things out myself." Victor smiled faintly. "None of us are ever fully ready, but the world doesn't wait for us to feel prepared. You're capable, Jonas. I see it, and I believe in you." As the weeks passed, Victor's condition worsened. Jonas began to visit more frequently, sometimes sitting in the study with him in silence, other times listening to Victor's stories about his early struggles and the lessons he had learned. Each visit deepened Jonas's understanding of the man who had so profoundly changed his life. Elliot, too, began to shift. Watching his father's unwavering commitment to Jonas forced him to confront his own prejudices. One evening, as Jonas was leaving the estate, Elliot stopped him by the car. "Jonas," he said, his tone less formal than usual. "Can we talk?" Jonas hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." Elliot rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology. I've been skeptical, to say the least. But I've watched how you've handled everything, how you've taken responsibility without asking for anything in return. And I get it now. My dad saw something in you, and he was right." Jonas blinked, caught off guard by the sudden admission. "Thanks, Elliot. That means a lot." Elliot nodded, his gaze steady. "I want to help. Whatever my dad has planned, I'm on board." In the weeks that followed, Jonas and Elliot began working together to develop a foundation in Victor's name. The Hammond-Turner Foundation would focus on providing resources for underprivileged families, offering scholarships, financial support, and mentorship programs. Victor, though too weak to actively participate, followed their progress with pride. On one of his better days, he sat with Jonas and Elliot, reviewing the plans for the foundation. "This," Victor said, his voice trembling but firm, "is what it's all about. Leaving the world better than you found it." The night Victor passed away, Jonas sat on the porch of his family's home, staring up at the stars. The loss was profound, but so was the sense of purpose Victor had left behind. As he gazed at the sky, he whispered a silent promise: "I'll make it count." The grand auditorium at the Detroit Civic Center buzzed with anticipation. Rows of chairs were filled with families, community leaders, and beneficiaries of the newly established Hammond-Turner Foundation. The air was electric, charged with the promise of change and hope. Jonas Turner stood behind the curtain, adjusting the lapel of his tailored suit. It felt strange, almost surreal to be here, a far cry from the worn delivery uniform he'd once donned daily. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the overwhelming sense of responsibility that filled him. This wasn't just about him. It was about Victor, his family, and every life they aimed to touch. A voice broke through his thoughts. "You ready?" Jonas turned to see Elliot Hammond, now a firm ally, standing beside him. The tension that had once defined their relationship was gone, replaced by mutual respect and shared purpose. "As ready as I'll ever be," Jonas said, managing a small smile. Elliot clapped him on the shoulder. "You've got this. And don't forget, Victor believed in you. We all do." Jonas nodded, the weight of those words grounding him. As the applause outside reached a crescendo, the announcer's voice echoed through the auditorium. "Please welcome the CEO of the Hammond-Turner Foundation, Jonas Turner." Stepping onto the stage, Jonas was momentarily blinded by the spotlight. He took a deep breath, scanning the audience. His mother, Margaret, sat in the front row, healthier and more vibrant than she'd been in years. Leah sat beside her, her face glowing with pride. And next to them was Elaine Hammond, her gaze steady and encouraging. Jonas gripped the edges of the podium, his voice steady but filled with emotion as he began. "Good evening, everyone. I stand before you today not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who understands what it means to struggle, and what it means to be given a second chance." He paused, his eyes searching the crowd. "Years ago, I was just trying to survive. My family and I were one step away from losing everything. And then, on a night I'll never forget, I met Victor Hammond." Jonas's voice caught, but he pushed through. "Victor wasn't just a man I saved. He was a man who saved me. He taught me that kindness is a chain reaction. One act can ripple out and change lives in ways we can't imagine. Tonight, we're here to continue that chain." The speech wove together personal anecdotes and moments of triumph. Jonas spoke of the Foundation's mission: to empower families through education, resources, and opportunities. His words were simple but profound, resonating deeply with the audience. He ended with a quote Victor had often said to him: "The true measure of success isn't what you achieve for yourself, but what you do for others. The room erupted in applause as Jonas stepped back, his heart full. He wasn't just honoring Victor's memory, he was building a legacy. Over the next few years, the Hammond-Turner Foundation flourished. Jonas's leadership and hands-on approach inspired trust and admiration. Scholarships were awarded, small businesses were funded, and countless families found a path to stability. The foundation became a beacon of hope in Detroit and beyond. Elliot, once skeptical, became a key partner in the organization. His financial acumen paired with Jonas's vision made them an unstoppable team. Together they expanded the foundation's reach, ensuring Victor's dream lived on. One summer evening, Jonas returned to his family's new home, a modest but comfortable house on a quiet street. The porch light was on, and the sound of laughter spilled out as he opened the door. Inside, Margaret was bustling in the kitchen, her energy restored. Leah, now a teenager, was helping her, giggling at something her brother Terrell had said. "Jonas," Leah exclaimed, running over to hug him. "You're home early." He ruffled her hair, a grin spreading across his face. "Figured I'd take a night off. How's the science fair project coming?" "Top prize is ours," Leah declared confidently. Jonas chuckled, the warmth of his family's love washing over him. This was what it was all about, these moments of joy, free from the shadow of survival. Later that night, Jonas stepped out onto the porch, the cool breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. He looked up at the stars, thinking of Victor. "You were right," Jonas murmured, his voice soft but steady. "Kindness does ripple out, and I won't stop." As he stood there, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was an email from a former scholarship recipient, now a teacher, thanking Jonas for giving her the chance to make a difference in her students' lives. The chain continued. Jonas smiled, a quiet resolve settling in his chest. The journey wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Years later, at a gala celebrating the Foundation's 20th anniversary, Jonas stood before an even larger crowd. He spoke with the same passion, his words now carrying the weight of experience. "Kindness," he said, "isn't just about helping someone in the moment. It's about building a bridge to a better future, not just for them, but for everyone their life touches." As the audience rose to their feet in applause, Jonas looked out and saw his mother, Leah, and even Elliot smiling back at him. The chain of kindness was unbroken, and its impact was endless. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.